Hello, everyone. Welcome to yours and my favorite part of the week. That's right, it is your online child developmental psychology course, and I'm here to walk you through the hottest topics in issues and themes in child development. So this chapter is really going to just lay out kind of very broad domains of analysis within developmental psychology, basically different approaches we take to conceptualizing development and some of the kind of broad factors that impact development. Very introductory, and we get into kind of more specifics as we move on to later chapters. So with that said, let's jump right into it. So how this usually works is I just generally read the slides, and then I just kind of give some global breakdown or some more specific breakdowns. If there's too much text on the slide, then I'll just kind of skim through it. But that's not the case here. So let's begin. Persistent theme in the field of psychology, that is early experience has a special, sometimes referred to as a sensitive period, unique impact on development. Development can be defined as a process in which each stage or gradual advancement lays a foundation for the stages that follow. So we know kind of like classically within psychology as a whole, really an emphasis on early childhood development. Now, later on, we find out that other aspects of your life matter to your development, and thus why we have life course development courses, because adolescence matters, early adulthood matters, older adulthood matters. All these different parts of our lives matter to development, but childhood development is thought to be this kind of special period, or this kind of sensitive period of development, wherein our development or kind of human development is very much accelerated during this sensitive period. And during those kind of periods of like accelerated development, we are more kind of plastic, more impacted by the environment around us. So maybe something like a big traumatic experience or a great, wonderful experience can kind of can kind of create kind of a broad infrastructure, biologically speaking, socially speaking, genetically speaking, that will impact us throughout our lives. And again, these are all kind of broad outlines, which we will cover more throughout this class. And then we have a general definition of development. There are kind of different definitions of development, but boom, we pick one and we move on with our lives. So why study development? One of the greatest challenges of studying child development is understanding what characteristics or factors turn the trajectory of development towards a positive versus a negative outcomes. That is, the question is, which factors increase the odds or act as risk factors for particular negative or positive outcomes? Poverty, racism, negative parenting practices, neighborhood violence, unstable employment, discrimination, abuse, among many other factors, increase the odds of negative developmental outcomes. Positive parenting practices, stable reciprocal relationships, public programs/policies, cultural practices, and community resources increase the odds of positive developmental outcomes. So obviously a fundamental question of developmental psychology is why do you develop the way you do? Why, how, so what are kind of the processes underlying development? And again, that can be biologically speaking, genetically speaking, or socially speaking. And kind of the idea here is to identify factors that predict the developmental outcomes. And those outcomes could, outcomes can include kind of short-term outcomes, like maybe an outcome that only affects maybe preschool education or something along those lines. So maybe early childhood abuse associated kind of with worse pre-K school performance. So kind of like a short-term or outcome. But also, there are long-term outcomes. So maybe early childhood abuse associated with later marital problems, something along those lines, or future high school dropout rate, something along those lines, or early death, who knows? So kind of the idea here is we have these short and long-term developmental outcomes, and we want to know, hey, how do we end up there? Thus, let's identify some factors, some specific environments that predict particular developmental outcomes. And one way you can conceptualize this is kind of think of this as odds or risk factors. So that is exposure to, for example, poverty, racism, negative parenting practices increase the odds of negative developmental outcomes. And kind of the same thing below that, wherein positive parenting practices, maybe specific positive public programs, community resources increase the odds of a positive developmental outcome. So it's not like determinative that this one environmental factor happens to you, and every single person is going to end up with the same outcome. But at the same time, we don't want to like overstate like this hyper individuality wherein we're all super unique, and every single factor impacts us all a little different. We understand that certain environmental factors, certain risk factors found in the environment increase the odds for negative development. So again, racism, poverty, violence, abuse, discrimination, all increase the odds of short and long-term negative developmental outcomes. And that's really how you should understand development in terms of the kind of that statistics base, my background is statistics. So let's briefly talk about parents and family members. Having an understanding of children's needs and abilities at each stage or age of development can help all parents provide the appropriate amount and type of support and stimulation to foster their children's growth and development. When expectations for a child's behavior are realistic, parents are more likely to use effective discipline strategies and rely less on punitive strategies. Parents must deal with a large amount of information that may also include inaccurate or contradictory information. Child development knowledge is particularly crucial for at-risk or disadvantaged parents. So kind of one big applied research reason for why we study development is that we can kind of take what we find and theoretically provide that information to parents or family members or caregivers, communities, whatever, to help kind of foster the development of positive developmental outcomes. So maybe what parenting practices, stuff like that can contribute to a positive developmental outcome, but not. And we'll also talk about other reasons why. It's important to research development momentarily, but kind of again focusing on parents. One big issue is that like there's just so much freaking information that exists. Like you Google something, and there'll be obviously thousands of results, and then kind of the idea that it's difficult because it's like, okay, which results are credible, which results are just complete like nonsense, which are like a little both, and I have to pick and choose what parts of this information to figure out. But ultimately, you're kind of like doing it on your own a lot of the times, which is quite challenging for anybody, let alone kind of just a parent who does not have a background in developmental psychology. So one reason why I kind of have you do a project, a research project in this class is kind of work through kind of identifying sources, how to read sources, how to take information from a source that can be applicable to your real world life, your real world needs. And that is difficult, that kind of credible source identification and extracting from sources what it is you need. It's a process that, I mean, people work through their entire lives, and that's, working through PhD programs and beyond. It's quite difficult, especially in the age of, internet, where there are just endless search results. That is quite overwhelming. So hopefully in this class, we can work to kind of develop those critical thinking skills and kind of how to identify sources and work through sources. And then finally, our last point here, child development for at-risk and disadvantaged parents. So kind of this knowledge of how to kind of raise a child in a heavily at-risk area. So maybe parenting practices are perfectly fine, but you live in kind of a dangerous, unstable neighborhood or a country, something along those lines, or maybe a bad historical era. Maybe there's a big Great Depression happening. And in those moments, at-risk children who are already living probably in poverty, maybe disabled, maybe a racial minority, those children are already at risk. So then you add kind of a larger stressor on top of it, and then they're really at risk. So kind of one feature of this class is that we're always kind of going to look at the most at-risk students. We're going to really talk about class, race, disability status, all these kind of LGBTQ identity, how those kind of factors can can place a child at risk in certain developmental contexts, which we will go over in detail throughout this class. And really our assigned readings also will kind of be centered around kind of this multicultural or kind of unique, under-researched, historically disenfranchised groups. Child development professionals, different ways and at different levels. People in all of the helping professions promote development for children and teens, engage in the identification and prevention of problems, and provide interventions when problems do occur. This could be positive or negative. Troubled teen industry, for example. So there's all kinds of, as we said before, there are thousands of search results related to psychology, but there are, relatedly, there are kind of thousands, hundreds of programs related to like, what do I do about my teen? What do I do about my toddler who's, whatever, crying or whatever, acting out or something along those lines. So you have a whole kind of industry of people or programs, companies, promoting their particular products that, like quote unquote, like solve the developmental difficulties that emerge. And one big one, especially really in kind of 90s, and still definitely exists today, very large really over $1 billion industry, was kind of this troubled teen industry. And I put a little video of it on there, wherein like children who had some kind of issues in school, maybe were expelled or had, some troubled child, engaged in some delinquency. What they would do was the parents, I think, would sign up their children to basically be kidnapped and put them into like a military boot camp and just kind of break them down psychologically. And kind of the idea was that through this like intensive martial emotional breakdown that the program designed to do, that the child will give up their problematic behaviors and develop into like a new pro-social child. We found out, that doesn't really work, and this is kind of like abusive. And there's a whole lot of documentaries and interesting history rooted in it. But kind of, again, the big point here is that child development professionals do exist. There are programs that are positive, and there are programs that are negative. And again, it is quite difficult for lay persons to kind of navigate what is appropriate, what is actually helpful to my child, what is harmful to my child, and most programs in general actually have kind of like no effect, really. So what is like not actually cost effective and really not serving the community or my specific family or my children well, or meaningful in any way. Moving on to why developmental psychology matters to policymakers. The well-being of children and families is also affected by the laws and programs that make up social policy. For example, food stamps / WIC. This program is associated with a reduced risk of having low birth weight or premature baby. Lifetime savings from lower costs of Medicare outweigh the program's costs. The Center of Child Development and Social Policy at Yale. When mental consultant available to help teachers to handle problem behaviors, fewer children were expelled in a Connecticut school. As citizens who played an important role in shaping social policy through contacting legislators, signing petitions, or voting. All right, so I alluded to some of this when I was going through my introduction video of my background of kind of looking at public policy and something called these macro and historical factors of development. That is like economic policies, political culture, like institutions, historical area you live in, all these kind of things predicting child developmental outcomes. And here are some specific kind of examples wherein food stamps, which are now called WIC, back in the day when I received food stamps. I grew up with food stamps basically my entire life. They were called food stamps. So I'm going to be like old school and call it food stamps. But anyway, so kind of the idea here is that this is a food supplemental program, and we understand that hunger, having proper nutrition impacts developmental outcomes. Thus, hey, this social policy is positively is associated with kind of positive developmental outcomes. And it's also, as stated, associated with a lower reduce of low birth weight, because this kind of makes sense. Theoretically, a pregnant mother now has access to more nutritional food than not having food stamps, which thus allows the child to develop prenatally and be born not low birth weight. Low birth weight is associated with a whole host of long-term and short-term developmental risks. So there you can see kind of a direct public policy impacting these individual developmental outcomes. So it's important to keep in mind that it's not just parents one-on-one impacting development, but other things impact development as well. You know, where your parents work, the historical area you live in, what community you live in, what country you live in, what schools you attend, what is your culture, what is this specific economic system within the country. You know, right here, literally, these are welfare programs. All these things, it's not just your individual one-on-one with parents, those matter, but all kinds of other factors also impact development. And that is typically and historically kind of underemphasized in the West. However, even in the West, there are centers of kind of child development and social policy. So you can see at Yale here that a whole center dedicated to analyzing the impact of specific policies on childhood development. And in this case here, the one study found out of Yale that the presence of mental consultants in schools reduce the likelihood of children being expelled because they probably have someone to talk to and kind of work through their problematic behaviors and maybe identify more appropriate behaviors. But that's that's just one example there. So you can range all the way from schools to like, hey, what's changed economic policy within the country? Like very large to very like community oriented or school oriented. And then finally, our last bullet points, which is a little wishful thinking. And there are obviously other ways to impact social policy, but I will not be talking about those on YouTube. But the point here is if you're interested in public policy and how it impacts, how it's related to human development, there is a niche for you. There are programs for you, and I kind of come from that background. So don't be afraid to kind of explore different interdisciplinary approaches to psychology and development. Now let's move on to specific domains of development, beginning with physical development, which is defined as or characterized as biological changes that occur in the body, includes changes in size and strength, as well as the integration of sensory and motor activities. Cognitive development, changes in the way we think, understand, and reason about the world. It includes the accumulation of knowledge, as well as the way we use that information for problem solving and decision making. Social emotional development, ways we learn to connect to other individuals and interact effectively with them. They understand, express, and regulate our emotions, and understand the emotions of others. So right off the bat, you can see that these three domains, although distinct, kind of all they all impact each other in some ways. So, for example, physical development, as you are able to walk around, maybe crawl, you're not just sitting still as a newborn baby anymore. You now can interact with people in new complex ways. That allows you to develop your social emotional skills. It allows you to interact with people. It also can contribute to cognitive changes. So maybe exploring the world gives you the opportunity to learn more about the world, accumulate knowledge, and practice kind of real-world problem solving. So you can see that although these domains are different, they all, like in everything in psychology, everything is like correlated and associated with each other, especially in development, because development, pretty much everything in the world impacts our development, or has the potential to impact our development. Thus, a lot of these things are kind of naturally correlated with each other. So as stated, all the components of human development constantly interact with each other. So during puberty, for example, adolescents begin to physically look like adults. This increases the likelihood that adults will treat adolescents like adults. It provides opportunities for greater cognitive and social maturity. Increased mobility, infants allows for greater interaction in the world and hearing quote unquote no. Shifts in infant, parent, extended family relationship with the child. So, kind of as stated before, all these different domains of development are constantly interacting with each other. And another example, I'll give you the crawling example, wherein an infant can now crawl, they can now interact with the world, maybe socialize with other baby peers or other adults in new ways, in new areas, accumulate more knowledge, but also during adolescence, when puberty typically begins. The adolescent will begin to look like a child, and then the parent will teach them like a child. Thus, maybe they have new mature interactions between the parent or caregivers or family or community members and the adolescents. So that allows the adolescent to engage in more complex social interaction, kind of work through new problems, accumulate new knowledge, but also through kind of this social interaction, develop new problem-solving skills, new ways of seeing the world. So kind of a difference, a new physical appearance, a new biological development, kind of signaling to other adults that, hey, this person is now cognitively capable of kind of engaging more mature conversation, which leads to greater cognitive development and greater social emotional development as well, because you can kind of connect with people on a deeper level. So again, just kind of a couple examples of how those different domains, although different, all interact with each other because we kind of exist in the real world where all these things are kind of correlated together. Ages and stages of development. So kind of just a broad overview of different kind of stages or different times within development. There's different ways to characterize this based on your specific school of thought, but we'll just keep it kind of broad for right now. Infancy, just the first year of life, total dependence on caregivers. They use senses to explore the world, foundations of language learning, expectation of the environment. They form emotional attachments. Toddler, 1 to 3 years, motor skill development, language development, and some independence and autonomy from caregivers. They learn skills necessary to understand other people's thoughts and feelings. Early childhood is typically described as occurring between 3 and 6 years of age. Use of play for learning about the physical and social world and peer interaction. So looking at infancy, really the big takeaway there is kind of like total dependence. And that is a unique kind of like feature of humans, the long period in which basically our children are just incapable of doing anything. Like they can't even like go and like forage for food, like some kind of like giraffe or something along those lines. Like they are just nothing, can't do anything. And kind of one theoretical reason for this is that humans are believed to, or it's been found that humans are heavily influenced by their environment. And kind of the idea here is that our brain is kind of naturally plastic. So you can think of like hot plastic, how you can like mold it. Well, kind of the idea here is that because our brains are born like plastic, that allows the environment to literally shape our brain, and not just like the structure of our brain, but kind of behaviors associated with our brain. So kind of our fear processing, our emotional processing, our stress response system, all these like biological experiences are shaped literally by the environment that we lived in. So because so humans are very, 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 very adaptive to their environment. Now, adaptive doesn't necessarily mean good. It's just like, hey, we are on a biological level, are programmed to kind of shape our development based on the world around us. And this can be good, or this can be bad, or it can be like, it's fine. And we'll go into more detail about that later on. But really kind of the big foundational moment right here is that we are extremely plastic and we are extremely adaptive to the environment around us. This is one way that culture is kind of like passed down, and why those developmental factors around us matter. Those environmental factors matter because we are extremely adaptive to our environment. And kind of the idea of early childhood development is that early adaptations serves as kind of the foundation, your kind of like housing structure that later experiences are built on top of. And how much you can change that structure really depends on the developmental outcome and also kind of your school of thought. And then jumping down to like early childhood, really about learning about physical and social world, peer interactions. You have a lot more kind of cooperative play, and play is a huge aspect of development. Humans are social beings. Social isolation literally physically hurts you. It neurologically harms you. So play is really a foundational element of humanity, kind of interacting with each other in imaginary and more complex ways, allows for kind of friendships to emerge, so kind of like social attachment to another person, positive peer interactions, but also kind of allow you to kind of engage in imaginary play, which allows you to develop cognitively. And all of these, one big theme for all of these domains is that social relationships matters. That is the kind of the root of human development. If you think about it, you know how we all talk about, the prefrontal cortex doesn't fully develop until 20-something years. It's a little too simplistic. We're not going to get into it in this class, but taking that at face value, and it's again too simplistic, that's basically arguing that, prior to a certain age, we're really, the foundation of our development is really based on kind of social relationships, not these like whatever, quote unquote logical kind of like mathematical kind of equation, but rather, I am a very young human, I'm forming attachments, I'm engaging in play, I'm engaging in interactions with other people, and those serve the basis. Those positive or negative social experiences form the basis for my later, those kind of interactions are associated with later relationship problems, but not just relationship problems, but high school dropouts, how well you're able to hold a job. All these kind of things are, at least on some grounds, rooted in these foundational relationships, not just between our parents, but the world around us, our peers, our extended family, our community. And thus adaptation, that is our brain kind of adapting to the world around us, a big component of that is really social relational. So those are kind of two big kind of things. Social relationships serving as a foundation of that kind of or as a one source of that adaptation that we have to meet our environmental expectations. Moving on to middle childhood, pick up this pace a little bit. This is where school becomes important context. Again, schools matter. If you think about it, you spend almost 40 hours per week in school, middle school, elementary school. So guess what? That context is going to matter. Again, an example of another context besides your house. Your home, your immediate caregivers matter into your development. And then adolescence, puberty, and thinking in more abstract levels and identity development. So now you're in high school, you're spending more times with peers, you're engaging in new social scenarios, all these things impacting our development. And it's important to keep in mind that each one of these kind of stages of development, you don't become this magical new person, but rather, as stated before, each of these kind of stages of development kind of set your trajectory for later development. You're walking down a road, and depending on that road that you choose, you're not choosing, obviously, but the road that you get placed on as an early childhood, you're walking down a particular road wherein you're at risk and you have higher odds for certain positive and negative outcomes. Does not mean that road can't be changed. You can't get off that road, but we understand that if you're kind of for example, a child who is depressed at 6 years old are more likely to be depressed at 18 years old than a child who wasn't depressed at 6 years old. Because I should say, our early life experiences predict and are associated with our later life experiences. So you don't become a magical new person when you enter from when you transition from middle childhood to adolescence. We bring our life histories with us at all times. Nature and nurture, and we'll go into more detail about this really next two chapters. So we're just going to briefly talk about this. Nature can be kind of defined as genetic inheritance, quote unquote, you're born this way, Lady Gaga style. Nurture, influence of the environment, you learned it, / a product of the environment. Nature through nurture, arguments that behaviors are expressed only through a process of constant interaction with the environment. And epigenetic inheritance, process in which the genes when received at conception are modified by subsequent environmental events that occur during the prenatal period and throughout the lifespan. Oh, very easy. Nature and nurture co-act to bring forth particular developmental outcomes. So kind of our big takeaway here is that classically, 100 years ago, it was like you are nature or nurture. Not really, or that or has gone bye-bye through the years. Now we understand that development consists of both nature and nurture, and they work together in complex ways. So for example, this epigenetic inheritance thing, which I'll talk about more in later chapters, but kind of the idea here is that you may be born with a certain predisposition, for example, to depression. However, that predisposition that you're born with does not mean you're for sure going to develop depression, but rather an environmental event has to happen wherein that predisposition in that gene becomes active. So you go from like a predisposition to like that gene is now on. So again, very crudely stated, you have a predisposition for depression. Boom, now a traumatic event happens to you, maybe abuse, maybe a war happens to you in that area, and all of a sudden you're super stressed out, and then that depressive gene is active, and now you're at greater risk of experiencing depression. So again, you may have that predisposition. That predisposition interacts with that environmental factor, that environmental event, a stressor in your life, which then activates that depressive gene, and now you're at higher risk of developing depression. And we'll cover this more in more detail in later chapters. Continuous versus discontinuous development, quantitative changes. This is described as changes in the amount or quantity of what you are measuring, for example, height and memorized information, versus qualitative changes, changes that alter the overall quality of a process or function, and the result is something altogether different. It is a fundamental change. Learning to walk is fundamentally different from crawling, puberty. So kind of we have two different changes here. Quantitative, which is basically more of something that you already have. So you already have a height, and through age, you get a little higher. You already have so much, your X amount of information memorized, but through time, you memorize new information. So it's more of something you already have. Versus qualitative changes, which again is kind of a fundamental change. You can think of this as like a staircase, where at each stair, you kind of unlocking a new ability, or you kind of fundamentally change in some way. So for example, puberty. All of a sudden you got puberty, you don't, and going through puberty and that time during adolescence is going to fundamentally change you at a biological and even at a social level. There is something, a shift to you as you have now approached kind of biological adulthood. And while qualitative change can be conceptualized as that staircase, with each new stair kind of transforming you into a fundamentally different person that's still built on your previous self, because it is a descending stair or ascending stair. Quantitative change is kind of like uphill. You're gradually acquiring, as you kind of march up the hill, gradually acquiring more height, more weight, more memorized information. Relatedly, stage theories describe development in terms of qualitative or discontinuous change. They're abrupt and qualitative. These are referred to as developmental stages. So like I said before, with qualitative theories and stage theories in particular, they argue for qualitative change. So again, fundamental change. Each one of those stairs, you fundamentally become like you develop a new ability. And that change, that new ability is abrupt in nature. You hit that stair, and boom, you unlock it. So it's rather quick and it's qualitative in nature. And thus there are stages of development. You can imagine conceptualize each stage as like one of those stairs. Versus incremental continuity theories, they describe development as occurring through quantitative or continuous changes. They are gradual and quantitative. So again, rather than that stair where you unlock new abilities and you're completely different each time, instead development is you're just growing a little bit at each time. You're building on the foundations, and slowly but surely, you're going up that hill towards whatever adulthood development. Next, stability and change. As we grow, develop, and mature, are we basically the same person we were at earlier stages, or do we reinvent ourselves along the way? Both stability and change are found in development. Some characteristics remain stable over time, but the way they are expressed change. Shyness and aggression are believed to be relatively stable. However, how the expression of these characteristics vary by age. Young children hit/kick when angry, but school-age children are more likely to taunt/name call. Adolescents attack each other. Another example, self-esteem. Young children have unrealistic high opinions of themselves. Levels drop as they enter school, as they have more chances for social comparison. Rises then again in adolescence. Is this stability or change? So kind of the idea of stability versus change is, are you kind of like locked in? How much of your development is locked in based on, it can either be early childhood experiences, infant experiences, prenatal experiences, or whatever, some kind of genetic biological thing, and how much are we kind of changing along the way? So how much of our development is stable and predictable through time, and how much change is there? How much reinvention of ourselves is there through time? And we found cases of both, and also a little more complex in this either-or stability versus change. So, for example, as stated before, shyness and aggression are thought to be relatively stable, that is, like unchanging through time. However, the forms in which that shyness is expressed can vary with age. So, for example, young children or young aggressive children, for example, may be more likely to hit or kick their school-age peers, but adolescents are maybe more likely to take that fight to the next level and or maybe engage in like cyberbullying or something along those lines. So kind of you still have that same aggression. However, how it is expressed is going to depend based on your social circumstances, where you are in the case of school, but also kind of like your age. So maybe now you have the ability to harass people online instead of just face to face. And a little similar to self-esteem. So we see in general, young children have like unrealistic high opinions of themselves, especially kind of the West. If you ask a child, hey, can you complete my trigonometry question for me or homework for me? They'll be like, oh yeah, hell yeah, dude, I'm gonna rock this. Like they believe they can do anything. However, once they enter school and they have more basically social opportunities to compare themselves to others, their self-esteem drops a little bit. And then once they reach adolescence, on average, self-esteem rises again. So is that characterized as stability? Is that better characterized as change? Or is this some kind of like combination of both? And those things are kind of debated in developmental psychology. I'm not going to go into the raw score versus rank thing right now, but kind of these are our broad outlines of stability versus change. Differences in development. Just like in health outcomes, developmental psychology aims to identify general principles to describe patterns of development. But there is variation in developmental outcomes. How do we predict those? You can conceptualize developmental factors as increasing/decreasing the odds of a developmental outcome in a particular developmental context. Environments impact, quote, individual developmental outcomes. Child development must deal with both universal aspects, where aspects are shared by all or almost all people, and those in which groups/collectives differ from each other and or individuals differ from each other. For example, puberty can be described as a universal human kind of phenomenon versus country/culture. These can generate collective/group differences, and then differences within the family can also produce individual differences. So we already talked about how odds and how conceptualized in development as kind of factors that increase or decrease the odds of a particular outcome within a particular developmental context. But also one kind of thing I want to talk about here is kind of this idea of identifying general principles of development. So on the one hand, we understand that you're not magically going to turn into like a bear when you're 10 years old. There is a universal developmental trajectory wherein you're not going to just start flying or be invisible or turn into a different species. There are universal developmental outcomes that exist within humanities as a whole. But however, there are also still kind of cultural differences. There are still country differences. There are subcultural differences. So there are differences that emerge, but at the same time, also universal developmental processes. So it's not this simple like, oh, everybody's different, so therefore anything can happen. Well, in that case, then there's really no point of science because we can't predict any developmental outcome. The goal is to theoretically predict outcomes using the scientific method and theoretically, in the case of like negative environmental factors, work to address them. But again, at the same time, just being exposed to a particular developmental factor does not mean for sure every single person who's exposed to a particular stressor, for example, are all going to end up with the exact same developmental outcome for a whole host of different reasons that we will talk about throughout this class. But for now, we have kind of universal developmental outcomes or processes such as puberty. We have country and culture kind of impacting group differences. So different group averages based on one country compared to another, and differences within the family, which can produce individual differences, but also maybe family-specific averages, like an average family's introversion versus another family's introversion due to whatever the type of child raising patterns that parents and children kind of interact with within their specific circumstance. Equal finality, different pathways result in the same outcome. ACEs, adverse child events, and genetic markers both predict depressive outcomes. Multi-finality, same pathway leads to different outcomes. Abuse increases risk of depression, but also other disorders. Some others are able to be more resilient than others. Intersectionality, how personal characteristics intersect with each other in complex ways that create unique developmental trajectories. Class, race, gender, disability status, LGBTQ+, and more impact interactions with government/economic institutions and individual people. In return, this impacts, quote, your developmental trajectory. So the point of equal finality is that we can have different things happen to us and both end up at the same outcome. So for example, adverse child events, which we'll talk about in depth in this class, basically it's just a list of traumatic things that happen to you throughout your life, and basically you add up that list, and then what researchers will say, is that cumulative stress number associated with X developmental outcome. And if you want to have fun, Google adverse child events and then just put any developmental outcome you want, and I guarantee there will probably be a study about it. They are basically correlated with anything. But in the case of equal finality, kind of the idea here is that we can have two different things happen to us and end at the same developmental outcome. So for example, I can have maybe a specific stressor, whatever, physical abuse happen to me and emotional abuse happens to you, and we both end up at the same developmental outcome, that is depression. Or maybe I experience abuse and then you have some kind of, I don't know, genetic predisposition for depression that I don't have, and we both end up being depressed. So we have different pathways resulting in the same outcome. Versus multi-finality, where the same pathways leads to different outcomes. So for example, say we both get whatever, emotionally abused, and I end up being depressed and you end up being, you have anxiety disorders. So even though we experience the same theoretical stressor, we have different developmental outcomes. Both negative, but different. At least according to the DSM-5, there's kind of debate about that. And there's a whole host of reasons for this. Maybe one person has more resilience and maybe more community resources, individual resources, family-related resources, not just economic, but like social resources wherein they can cope, use their family to kind of deal with those stressors more. Or maybe we're in different environments wherein my environment makes me a little more likely to kind of like manifest that like emotional trauma through depression, versus your environment making you're more likely to like have that developmental outcome anxiety emerge. And this is where things get a little more complex. We're not going to go into that much detail right now. But again, kind of same stressor can impact you in multiple ways. Or we can, different stressors can end up at the same developmental outcome. And we also have this idea of intersectionality. So kind of the idea here is that who we are as a people impact how the world interacts with us. So whatever, race, class, gender, disability status, that impacts how people socialize with us. That impacts how governments treat us. So whatever, 50 years ago, it was believed by the APA, the American Psychological Association, that being gay was like some kind of deviant, biologically not real thing. Thus, growing up in that era and being publicly gay means government institutions are going to be like, hey, you're literally like making this up, slash, I don't know, you're like, I don't know, immoral or something along those lines. And maybe your peers will interact with you more negatively. But ultimately, kind of that historical context that we live in kind of our various identities, but not just identity in the case of like class, like where you stand in society. That's really not like an identity thing. It ultimately, kind of these features of us impact how people treat us one-to-one and how our institutions treat us. Thus, our individual developmental outcome is always going to be impacted by this larger collective of the world around us. There is no such thing as this specific, or I should say kind of like this isolated development wherein you are you and you're unaffected by other people. That is kind of a common notion in the West, but you know, we are all, a key element of developmental psychology is that we are impacted by the world around us. And thus, theoretically, you can change that world and produce better developmental outcomes, going back to that Yale Center for Social Policy. Moving on to niche picking, a concept that suggests people actively seek out environments that are a good fit with their genetic makeup. Children actively shape their experiences by choosing environments that enhance or inhibit the characteristics that initially attracted the child to the environment. So kind of the idea here is that maybe we have some kind of predispositions or that kind of impact our personalities. So say just I'm naturally, quote unquote naturally, to the extent that that even exists, debated, whatever, we'll talk about that later on. But say I'm just like a extroverted person, something along those lines. I'm either naturally that way, or as I grew up, I went through a series of adaptations that resulted in me being extroverted, whatever the reason. I am now extroverted, and now what is going to happen is I'm going to seek out experiences that match well with my extroversion. And by doing so, it allow me to kind of enhance my extroversion. So for example, say again, I'm extroverted. So I've been decided every Friday night, I'm going to go to a rave. And woo, it's the best time of my life. And not only that, I'm having a great time. Everybody else sees we're having a great time. Everybody's on Molly, whatever. We're all getting down. Everybody's hitting the gritty. Everyone's nice to me. Everyone likes me. And now I'm like, oh wait, that was a great time. I'm going to start going to the club 2 times a week. I'm going to go to raves all the time. And basically what you see here is that may have that predisposition or kind of that background of extroversion. Makes me more likely to choose events wherein my extroversion can be enhanced. And then I get social feedback, like it's a good time, and I'm like, oh, this is great. I love being extroverted. I made all kinds of friends, and I'm just fulfilled in some way. And thus, I will be more likely to engage in more extroversion, and thus that extroverted tendency in me will become more stable through time, through these social experiences. Context of development, we'll talk about some of them now. They include all settings in which development occurs, aka the entire world, aka this is very massive. So some of those contexts include the family, obviously. This is argued typically as the primary context for children in the West. So, it makes sense. We spend a lot of time with our families, especially as a newborn baby, and thus that sensitive period of development, we're interacting with our parents directly, and this is contributing to our development. Socialization, instilling of the norms, values, attitudes, and beliefs of a culture so that children grow up to be a positive, maybe contributing member of their society. You can socialize morally repugnant things. So one way that kind of the country you live in, the culture you live in, the historical era you live in, and the dominant views of that historical era is kind of passed down to you, passed down to new generations, I should say, is through the socialization process, wherein parents, community members, extended family, caregivers, whatever, instill within the child certain values and attitudes about how to approach the world, certain belief systems. And theoretically, the idea is that you, as a parent, as a caregiver, are teaching the child how to interact within the world, within your culture, within your historical moment, in a theoretically a positive way. But however, it's not always positive. You can grow up in a country, in a time, in a culture that is morally repugnant, and you can be socialized into horrible, horrible things. However, socialization is a process that exists that can be either positive or negative or whatever, someplace in between. School. U.S. children spend about 6.5 hours a day in school. Within this context, children learn academic skills such as reading, writing, and arithmetic. Older children and adolescents are prepared for higher education or entry into the workforce. Schools play a role in socializing children to become, quote, good, aka what a particular society defines as good, citizens. Schools have taken on other functions such as providing meals. So schools, again, I already mentioned this before, you spend a ton of time at school. And thus, because our environments matter, those school environments are going to impact our development. We're going to spend a lot of time socializing with peers, maybe spending time in extracurriculars, interacting with teachers, just a ton of social opportunities, and kind of opportunity for just kind of the development of academic skills. At the same time, socialization is also occurring. So not just from your family, but also in your school. There are certain textbooks that people select all textbooks have certain ideological persuasions to them, which reflect a given cultures, a given countries, a given states, a given historical moments, kind of understanding of norms, values, and attitudes that are taught to children, and thus further socializations within that context occurs. Community. The characteristics, the nature, quality, safety of the community in which children live impact many aspects of development. Public recreation spaces, parks, increase the likelihood of children spending time outside their homes in pro-social environments. Community resources, quote-unquote, protect or buffer the negative impacts of trauma/stress. They reduce the potency of a stressor. Resilient factors exist within environments. Community violence/noise/underdevelopment increases the risk of negative developmental outcomes. So just like schools, other developmental contexts also impact our development. So in our case, our community. So how safe it is, the quality of it, how much pollution there is, how strong the social ties are, they impact development. Research has found that public spaces, parks increase the likelihood of children spending more time socially developing and developing pro-social kind of skills. Not only that, but there are community resources that exist that quote-unquote protect or buffer the negative impacts of stress. So what that means is, so imagine some kind of extreme stressor, whatever, emotional abuse, some kind of physical abuse, or maybe whatever, a natural disaster hits your area and boom, everybody's traumatized. Well, kind of the idea of protective factors is that, or buffer factors, is that it kind of reduces the severity or the odds of that trauma negatively impacting you. So, for example, during a hurricane, your house gets blown away, and all of a sudden Congress passes, woo, everybody gets a free housing repairs, and now you have food, lunch programs, whatever. That protects you from some of the stress because, hey, that's one less stressor in my life. But also maybe a community resource could be free mental health or something along those lines. So you have someone to talk to. You have emotional support. So you can have kind of, material, economic, and social kind of community resources that decrease those odds of a stressor impacting you negatively. At least, or I should say, at least kind of decrease the likelihood of that trauma resulting in kind of long-term developmental issues. So maybe you have some kind of acute problems, but through time, thanks to those community resources, you kind of get back to like homeostasis. Next, moving on to socioeconomic status, an indication of the social standing of an individual or group based upon a combined measure of income, education, and occupation. It's kind of a way to say class without saying it. Differences in SES are often associated with inequalities in access to resources in a society, and these inequalities increase the risk of negative outcomes in children and adults. So poor nutrition during pregnancies, growing up in unhealthy and unsafe neighborhoods, attending a below average school, more likely to experience stressors and have less social / collective resilience. So SES is basically a way to talk about class. It's kind of debated what SES is, and it's always kind of a messy little definition. It's because there's really not a great way to talk about class. In psychology, they want to kind of talk about it, so they'll dance around it. Sometimes they'll kind of just typically kind of just say like poverty or something along those lines. But why poverty actually matters is because you're exposed basically to more stressors, and at the same time you have less protective factors. So you're getting hit with like a double whammy, and it's not just like one stressor, but it's like everywhere, right? So whatever, you're less likely to have quality food, more likely to encounter pollution, more likely to have unsafe neighborhoods, below average schools. Everybody's going to be super stressed out because of those reasons. So maybe your parents are stressed out, which kind of decreases their ability to engage in sensitive kind of reciprocal parenting because they're super stressed out and maybe dealing with their own kind of mental health issues kind of things. So kind of one context of development is lower class poverty, regions of poverty, and we're going to kind of talk about that throughout this course because it is kind of just one kind of example of how and why our environments matter and how it impacts us developmentally. Culture includes the behaviors, norms, beliefs, and traditions that are shared by a group and that are transmitted from one generation to the next. It emerges from a group's / a collective's environmental niche and promotes survival of the group by improving groups' ability to meet the demands of a given environment. It helps us find meaning and purpose in our lives. Parental ethnotheories, framework for understanding how a particular cultural context impacts a child's development. Within a given culture, parenting practices reflect the values, beliefs, and traditions of a culture. Some are universal, while others are much more cultural, have much more cultural variability. Parents love their children versus sleeping arrangements of a family. So kind of a broad definition here of culture, and kind of the idea here is, as we talked about before, kind of how socialization works. Parents socialize their children to certain norms, beliefs, and behaviors that the culture at large values. And this is kind of just one form of collective niche picking. So throughout this course, we'll talk about traditional kind of like individual developmental outcomes, but also collective. All of these kind of concepts can also have a collective component to it. So in this case here, kind of collective group environment niche picking is kind of the idea is that we as a culture live within a particular historical moment, live within a specific geography that impacts how we interact with the world around us, and thus we have to adapt to that geography as a means of survival, and thus we're going to pass down intergenerationally sets of norms and beliefs that theoretically allow us to kind of operate and survive and have have meaning and purpose in our lives. Not always not always the case. You can have, again, negative kind of socialization practices, but kind of these are our broad outlines. And we understand that, for example, numerous studies that have found that natives who have their cultures forcefully removed from them, which obviously did happen, increases their likelihood to have alcoholism or other kind of like negative long-term developmental outcomes. One reason is because you're kind of stripping that identity, that collective identity, that purpose in their life, that meaning in their lives, and they're kind of like less left, again, stressed out, kind of dislocated from the world around them, and you remove kind of their collective resilience, their collective protective factors, that is literally their culture. And some parenting practices are kind of like universal, and others are cultural variability. So, for example, all parents, broadly speaking, love their children. How they express that love can vary across cultures. Versus, however, sleeping arrangements. There's a lot more cultural variability of where a child should sleep, how you should respond to them if they're crying, when it's like 2 in the morning or something along those lines. So again, on the one hand, much more kind of universal, foundational aspects of humanity, aka like love your children, versus kind of more cultural decision-making, where to sleep. And this can be rooted in like safety concerns or a whole host of other reasons. Cultures can be described as among a continuum from individualism to collectivism. In individualistic cultures, heroes typically are self-made people who manage to rise from challenging circumstances to become successful. They're independent, competitive, and unique. In collectivist cultures, they emphasize more obligation to your family or your group. There's variation in how that is defined. An identity is derived from, quote, individual social affiliations. They emphasize harmony, sharing resources, awareness of how a behavior affects others. So this is just one way that you can describe culture, again, as this continuum of individualism versus collectivism. So you can think of it as a score of 0 to 100, with 100 being collectivism or whatever, and then you fall in that range. So it is not an either or situation, but rather kind of a range. And in each different cultures within that range, more individualistic values include, again, being like independent, or this idea that like you're unique, that you've maybe encountered some challenging circumstances, but through your own self-will and through kind of like your quest to fulfill your ultimate kind of destiny, you become the successful story that you are, so through your own kind of unique hashtag journey. And that can involve like a lot of competition. Versus kind of collectivist idea here is that you have an obligation to your group or your family. Now, how you define that group can vary. It can be your immediate family or a small like little tribe or whatever neighborhood, or it can be an entire country. It can be, I don't know, an international, some kind of organization, something along those lines. So there is a lot of variation in how that collective is defined, but again, broadly speaking, kind of the idea is that you have an obligation to your group and that your identity derives from kind of like your social role. Thus, you're going to have kind of different values that you teach to children, such as sharing resources within that group, however you define it, and awareness of how your behavior affects others within the group. It's important to keep in mind that there is no single, quote, independent, interdependent, individualistic, or collectivist cultures. They can have regional similarities with specific differences due to a host of historical, social, and geographical reasons. Latin American countries typically are described as collectivist/interdependent. However, in one study, Latino samples emphasized independence on 6 of 7 cultural dimensions measured. In the Middle Eastern sample, they emphasize self-reliance, toughness, and awareness of social consequences of behavior. That is a mixture of both collective and individualistic tendencies. So kind of like how you can define the collective differently, there is no single independent, individualistic, collectivist culture. There's going to be regional dynamics, and you can see this contemporarily and throughout a historical period. So you can have kind of like regional similarities, for example, where it's like, oh, these regions engage in these kind of things that are the same, wherein only this region engage in these activities, but there's still going to be some kind of regional differences. Or even like within a country, like, oh, as a whole, our country does X, Y, Z, but still there are regional variations of kind of particular daily behaviors. And then finally, the study is basically just saying that in cultures that are traditionally defined as kind of interdependent or collective, you could still find independence, quote unquote, behaviors that are traditionally defined as independent within those cultures. And even in regions that are both defined as collective, so for example, Middle Eastern and Latino countries, and people are generally defined in more collective terms, you could still see differences between those two samples, or those two regions. So although they're both collective, there are still kind of differences between these countries. Cultural expectations are taught explicitly and tacitly. They change through time. Culture is not static, unchallenged. So to stop there for a moment, one thing is important to think about culture is that culture changes through time, because culture is kind of a way that we adapt to our environment around us intergenerationally. And it kind of, again, gives us meaning in life. But those things change through time. That does not mean the change is good or always bad. It is just a fact of life. Because we're a social species, we will be impacted kind of by our social circumstances. And thus, you see that across the world, really, right now, is that the world is becoming more individualistic, which, on one hand, can be quite problematic because many countries are kind of losing their kind of collectivist culture and kind of trying to figure out how to navigate that all of a sudden. And this is kind of related to kind of globalization, all these other larger trends, which again demonstrates that kind of these historical era and these kind of macroeconomic political things impact our development. But moving on, looking at specific explicit and tacit ways that cultural expectations are taught. Look at me when I'm talking to you versus looking at me directly is disrespectful. Instructing the child is explicitly teaching cultural expectations. So either way, either look at me when I'm talking to you or don't look at me when I'm talking to you because it's disrespectful. It's ultimately teaching a cultural expectation of how to behave among elders or people that you're supposed to respect. Feeding practices. In the US, you're more likely to put food down and let the child, quote, independently eat food. It helps the child learn independence. In collectivist countries, more likely to take a hands-on role in feeding. It teaches cooperation and patience when working with others. It's equal finality. So feeding practices, much more tacitly taught. You're not really telling the child, okay, kid, eat your food right now so you become an independent, individualized person. But rather, it's more tacitly. It's not said, but you're still teaching those values. So by allowing the child to eat independently, teaching more independence in collectivist countries, being more likely to take a hands-on role, thus stressing cooperation. Like by default, you have to wait for your parent to interact with you to eat. This is an example of equal finality because although we're engaging in kind of different forms of feeding practices, we ultimately end up with the same result, and that is a kid, an adult can eat independently. And we're going to circle back around to this in the next chapter or two, but here's just an example of the many different environmental factors that can impact our development. And again, ranging from really our parents, our caregivers, all the way up to like our social conditions, our political systems, our economy, and the historical era we live in. So all these things impacting our development. And thus why I'm an interdisciplinary researcher with backgrounds in political science and kind of history and stuff as well. Next, we're going to wrap up with this idea of psychology as weird. Weird stands for white, educated, industrial, rich, democratic countries. That acronym you can kind of piece apart a little bit to see if there's any kind of bias there. But still, kind of taking this framework, and all frameworks are a little hit or miss, but this is kind of one that's good enough to just kind of introduce you to some concepts or constructs and some challenges actually that are emerging in psychology. So kind of break this down. U.S. Americans make up 68% of psychology participants of all the studies of psychology in the world. Okay, 68% of them are U.S. Americans, and you can see this in the pie chart. A full 96% of psychology participants are from Western industrialized countries. So we have, on one hand, 68% of psychology participants in the world being U.S. Americans. And then not only that, but 96% of psychology participants are from Western industrialized countries. And this is despite the fact that weird countries only make up approximately 16% of the world's population. So although they only make up 16% of the world's population, they again make up 96% of psychology participants. Continuing on, 70% of participants are psychology undergraduates. It supports the argument that general psychology does not concern itself in general with context or content. Is the fact that psychology has adopted a sampling methodology that largely ignored questions about the generalizability of these findings. The extreme narrow samples most psychologists use make good sense if the mind operates exclusively according to universal laws. So basically our takeaways here is that U.S. Undergraduate university students are way overrepresented represented in psychology research and in weird populations. Again, Western, educated, industrial, rich, democratic, again, some kind of bias within them, but fine, we're working with what we have, are overwhelmingly represented within research, which kind of demonstrates that in general, psychology is really traditionally not that focused on culture. However, this is changing, but it still takes a long time to do this research. Just because, okay, we care now, it still is going to take like, decades to even begin to figure it out, because frankly, we don't know that much about psychology as it is anyway. So let alone adding these other dimensions. So the question is basically okay, so we have all these results, but do they apply to the whole world? Maybe, maybe not. We don't know. Sometimes they can, sometimes they won't. But ultimately, we don't know. So it's not the fact that, so it's not stating this weird construct. It's not arguing that for sure every single thing is going to be different because we're all unique individuals, blah, blah, blah. But rather, we don't know, but we do know that culture, country, historical era matters, and thus some things for sure, and we've already found, are not going to be universally applicable across all cultures. And thus we should do more cultural research, and thus again why this class will really emphasize underrepresented groups that in general have been kind of overlooked in psychology. For the purpose of this class, we're going to operationally define weird as any samples that include white, suburban, middle-class U.S. university students. So any study that has that sample will be classified as weird. Non-weird will be basically anyone else in the world. Name any country you want in the world, or any historically understudied group in the U.S. This could be racial, sexual orientation, trans individuals, lower working class, poor, disabled, whatever. Name your group that has historically been disenfranchised, and those are non-weird, that for the purposes of this class. Again, all kind of psychology theories have kind of different definitions of terms based on kind of their school of thought. And for this class, this will be our operational definition of weird. And we'll wrap up with source quality, beginning with the peer review process. Process to determine which articles a scientific journal will publish. Scientific articles are submitted to a journal to be reviewed by professional experts before they're accepted for publication. It ensures a level of professional scrutiny before publication. This does not mean that every study is correct. There are competing theories, and many studies do not replicate for various reasons. Evaluating information on the web is challenging. How do you develop critical evaluation skills? So kind of one idea and why we're going to only be using peer review sources for our course is that there's a certain level of scrutiny required. Basically, in order to submit or publish a peer-reviewed study or paper within a scientific journal, you have your submission has to be reviewed by typically 3 to 5, usually around 3. It can be 2 sometimes, but around 3. Professionals within that field. They review your paper and they say, okay, this meets, this stands up to whatever scrutiny, this is well designed, the statistics make sense, but the super majority of the time, 99% of the time, you're going to receive feedback with changes that they recommend to you. You then kind of enact those changes, rewrite parts of your submission, and then you resubmit it again. And this process literally can take years, depending on the journal. This is a long, long process. So it ensures some level of professional scrutiny. However, it's important to keep in mind that just because something is published does not mean, okay, this is 100% correct, that everything here is right, because you'll notice, or as if you advance in psychology, that some people will measure the same construct and they'll find a result, and another study will measure the exact same construct and then not find that result. And then it's like, okay, so why does one study have different results than the other? And then you have to break it down in more like complex ways. So Just because something present or something that or you find a particular study does not mean, or a particular result does not mean, okay, well, that's the universal finding, the end. There are literally tens of thousands of studies on like the same topic because it's for a whole host of reasons. Now let's finally wrap it up with ways to kind of identify sources and kind of improve as a scientific thinker. First being become a critical thinker. Actively engage with the material to think critically on the information. Understand science is an organized body of knowledge that is always changing and growing. Guard against generalizations. It is dangerous to generalize from personal experiences to general statements about everyone else's experience, as well as to generalize findings based on one population to another population with different characteristics. Avoid perceptual bias. Tendency to see and understand something based on the way you expected it to be. Preconceived notions affect how you process new information. So to briefly touch on this, guard against generalization, you can imagine me sitting in like the suburbs and looking outside and being like, well, everybody here drives really nice cars and everything's like super quiet. Also, our neighbors are neurotic as hell, but a little kind of like intense, you know, always on the Nextdoor app or whatever. But whatever. Ultimately, I look outside and I see the world. I'm like, okay, well, I see the world. It's right there. Therefore, this is how the world is for everybody. You're overgeneralizing your kind of hashtag lived experiences to the entire world around you. Which is problematic because you don't know what you don't know. And just because you see something in front of you does not mean it applies to the entire world population. Avoid perceptual bias, and then we'll leave it off here. It's kind of like we operate in the world and expect certain things in the world, which is, you know, a human feature of humanity. But it's important to keep that in mind that that is what you are doing. That is that you have a preconceived notion of how something should be based on your life history, which again can be very limited. So with that said, thank you so much everyone for listening. I hope you have a great week, and I will see you next week. Thanks everyone. Bye.